Hello, this is Professor Klorman speaking. This is Analysis Video 1, Chord Qualities and Harmonic Analysis in Context. With each of these analysis videos, the idea is I'd like to go a little bit deeper with you with the content you've studied already in the textbook and in tutorial, and hopefully what we'll cover here will be helpful for you as you do the weekly assignment. You can feel free to press pause, to go back and listen to parts of it again. If you have questions or comments about anything I cover here, we have a discussion board on myCourses. I'd love to hear your thoughts or things I could clarify any further. I'm going to try to keep these relatively concise and to the point, so let's dive right in. Our first example is an excerpt from a song by Josephine Lang. When I say a song, I mean a piece for piano and voice, but here we're just going to hear the piano introduction. Josephine Lang lived in the 19th century, roughly the same time as Robert Schumann, and she was known for music that she composed for voice and piano in particular. Let's have a listen to this excerpt.
The instructions ask us to identify the chord in each measure and to ignore any notes that are in triangles because those are not part of the chord. Those are embellishing notes that we're going to study later in the semester. Okay, so let's try this in measure 1. The first step is to identify all the notes you see. I see Ds, I see As, I see F sharps, and that's it in measure 1. To figure out what kind of chord it is, I have to take those three notes, D, A, F sharp, and unscramble them or stack them in thirds. So D and A is not a third, but D, F sharp, A, those are thirds. D, F sharp, A is the chord in bar 1. And in fact, in bar 2, I have F sharp, D, A. Those are the same three notes. So the chords are D, F sharp, A in bar 1 and in bar 2. The next step, this is a little shortcut that will help you do analysis a little more quickly. Once you've identified a harmony, look through the excerpt and see if you find those same notes, that same harmony later on in the piece. Do you see any measure that has Ds, F sharps, and As? How about measure 5, the pianissimo? That's D, F sharp, and A as well. Now let's try measure 3. I have Es, Bs, Ds. We're going to ignore the A's because those are in triangles. Well, B to D is a third, but how does E fit into that? Sometimes we have incomplete chords. In fact, the instructions here give us a hint. The instructions point out that the third is missing in bar 3. So could we imagine here that the chord is E, G, B, D, and that the G is missing, or the G is what we call an implied note. If I think about that harmony, E, G, B, that's a minor triad, and D is a minor seventh. That makes this an E minor seventh chord. And lastly, we have measure 4 that has A, C sharp, E, G. Those are all the notes we have. That's a seventh chord. What kind of seventh chord is it? Well, A, C sharp, E is a major triad. A to G is a minor seventh. So this is what is sometimes called a major minor seventh chord, but often people call this also a dominant seventh chord. So an A dominant seventh chord. So we've completed the first step of our analysis, which is to identify each of the chords in terms of what's the root and what's the quality. But then the next step is to do it in terms of Roman numeral analysis. How do we do that? First thing we need to know is what key we're in. That way we can express each of these chords with a Roman numeral instead of a letter name. So what key are we in? Well, we have two sharps, so that would be either D major or B minor. Which one are we in? Well, first of all, when we listened to it, it sounded like major. Secondly, we begin with a D major chord and end with a D major chord. And then the other clue is that to be in B minor, we would really need some accidentals. We would need a leading tone to B minor. We'd need some A sharps. But in this piece, we don't have any A sharps, we have A naturals. So those are some reasons why I can say with confidence we're in D major. And that means that each of the D major triads is a 1 chord. So I've labeled 1 chords in bar 1, bar 2, and then bar 5. Why do I put 5, 3, and 6/3 and 5/3? Well, 5/3 is what we put when we have a root position 1 chord. That means a D major chord with a D in the bass. We have that in the first measure and in the fifth measure. Whereas in measure 2, we have a first inversion D major chord. That's a D major chord with an F sharp in the bass. In other words, the third of the chord is in the bass. The only note you need to look at to know the inversion is the bass. It doesn't matter what order the other notes are in. The only thing that matters is the bass. How do you figure out these numbers if you forget them? Well, first thing is you should memorize them. But second thing is you can actually just measure the intervals from the bass. So for instance, in measure 1, D is in the bass. If I go up a fifth, I get an A. If I go up a third, I get an F sharp. That's where the 5/3 comes from. In measure 2, F sharp is in the bass. If I go up a sixth, that's a D. If I go up a third, that's an A. That's where these numbers for figured bass come from. You'll notice the numbers appear a little diagonally in this video. Technically, they should be right on top of each other, 5/3, 6/3. Then the last thing you want to know is the way we've written it here is perfectly acceptable, but usually for root position triads, we leave out the 5/3. And usually for first inversion triads, we leave out the 3. So the real way to write this is 1 and 1/6. Well, how about the E minor chord, the E minor 7th chord, and the A dominant 7th? Well, in the key of D major, E is the 2nd scale degree. So that's going to be a 2 chord. In the key of D major, A is the 5th scale degree, so that's going to be a 5 chord. Now the last thing is I need to make sure I think about the qualities of these chords. For major chords and for dominant 7th chords, we're going to use capital Roman numerals. But for minor chords and for diminished chords, we're going to use lowercase Roman numerals. And that's pretty much it for our harmonic analysis of this excerpt. One question I wanted to go over, though, in the first measure, I said that since it's a root position chord, we don't need to include the figured bass. But how about the 2/7 chord and the 5/7 chord? Those are both root position chords. Well, the reason is if I have a triad, I don't need to put the figured bass, the 5/3, to show a root position triad. It's just assumed that measure 1 is root position. But measure 3, that's not a root position triad, that's a root position 7th chord. So I need to include that 7 in the 2/7 and in the 5/7 to show that those are 7th chords. That's a really important detail. We can't leave that out. Now, one last thing to think about that might help you sometimes with analysis is it sometimes is helpful to make something that I'm going to call a harmonic reduction. It's basically a simplification of the rhythms, a simplification of the texture or the figuration of the piece, where we reduce it or we distill it down to just the basic chords. It looks something like this. You might sometimes find it helpful to write out on a separate piece of manuscript paper, just a scratch paper while you're working it out, what's the bass note, what are the other notes in the chords, just to see a simpler version of the music you're analyzing. If that ever helps you just to focus in on which are the notes in the harmony, this is a harmonic reduction. And a cool thing about harmonic reductions is that they sound a lot like the original piece. I'll show you what I mean. Let's have a listen to the original, the Josephine Lang, and then we'll listen to the harmonic reduction. And I think you'll have a sense that you're hearing pretty much the same harmonies, that the one is sort of a simpler version of the other. Our next example comes from a chorale by Johann Sebastian Bach. In next week's video, we'll talk a little bit more about chorales in general and Bach's in particular. This one comes from one of his most famous compositions, the St. Matthew Passion. Let's have a listen to the excerpt. I'll play the recording just a little bit longer than what you see on the screen. So just like before, we're going to begin the analysis by simply identifying each chord. The first bar, the upbeat to the first bar, I have D, F sharp, and A. In fact, the key signature, again, is two sharps, and we're in major, so we're in D major. Every place I have D, F sharp, A, it's going to be a 1 chord, a capital 1 chord for D major, since that's the key we're in. Do you see any other D, F sharp, A chords? Well, we have lots of D major triads, which makes sense, since we're in the key of D major. How come I had to write 1-6? Well, if you look at that chord, take a look at the bass. If F sharp is in the bass, it's a first inversion chord. I have to put the 6 for 1-6, first inversion. All the other 1 chords are root position. How about the chord on the downbeat of bar 2? I have G, G, D, and B. Why did I say G twice? Well, the bass and tenor are doubled on the same note. That's why there are 2 stems. So G, D, B, that would be G, B, D, a G major chord. Do you see any other G major chords? Any other chords with G, B, D? And what Roman numeral would that be in the key of D major? So we've used a major 4 for G major chords. We have a 4 chord, we have a 4-6 chord. How about the downbeat of bar 2? I have a G, B, and D, but I also have an E. Well, that doesn't make sense as a 4 chord. How should I analyze the downbeat of bar 2? Okay, so it's actually E, G, B, D, an E minor 7th chord with G in the bass. So a first inversion 7th chord, that is a 6-5 chord, 2-6-5. That's an easy mistake to make. If a chord has 4 notes, make sure you've accounted for all 4 of those notes. Okay, we're almost done. How about right after the 4-6 chord? See where you have the 8th notes? So I have a C sharp there, an A, an E. Oh, and don't forget the soprano, that's a G. 4 different notes. How can I unscramble those to figure out the chord? C sharp, A, E, G. That would be A, C sharp, E, G. What kind of chord is that? What kind of Roman numeral? And what inversion? So that's a dominant 7th chord. A, C sharp, E, G, dominant 7th. If I have the C sharp in the bass, that's a first inversion 7th chord. So since it's a dominant quality chord, I'm using a capital 5. Since it's a first inversion 7th chord, I'm putting 6-5. And remember, if you ever forget the numbers, you can always check by looking at the intervals. C sharp is in the bass. If I go up a 6th, that's an A. If I go up a 5th, that's a G. That's where those numbers 6-5 come from. And lastly, right before the end of the excerpt, that's just a 5 triad, A, C sharp, E, capital 5. Let's listen to the recording just once more to compare it against our analysis. Next, we'll listen to the song Aloha Oi, written by the Hawaiian queen Lili'uokalani in 1878. This song has been covered and recorded quite a bit. It's possible you'll recognize it. We're going to hear a performance by a Hawaiian singer performing with ukulele, so it will be a little bit different than what you're seeing on the screen, but it's close enough that you should be able to get an idea. So the key signature is 4 flats, that's A flat major, And that's the chord we have at the very beginning of the excerpt. I have A flats, C's, and E flats. And as per usual, I just scan through the excerpt and see every time I have those notes, I'm just going to put down the same Roman numeral. That's going to help my analysis go a little bit quicker. If A flat is in the bass, I'm going to treat that as a root position chord. And this is a little point I wanted to talk just a bit about. In measure 2, you notice you have a bunch of different notes in the left hand, at least in the score of the piece. But we're going to take the lowest note of that chord and treat that as the bass note. So since the lowest note is A flat, we're going to call that a root position triad. That leaves us with 2 other measures we have to deal with, measure 1 and measure 3. So I'll let you pause the video, take a moment to think about those chords. What kind of chords are they, and which Roman numerals should you put there? So the first full measure is a 4 chord. That would be D flat, F, A flat. That's a major chord, capital 4. And the third full measure, that's a 5-7 chord. There's a bunch of notes in triangles that we're going to ignore, but the main notes are E flat in the bass, G, B flat, D flat. For each chord, we're going to take the lowest note of the whole chord, and we're going to call that the bass. So that's how I determine the inversions. This instance has all root position chords. One thing you might have noticed by now, you'll notice several of the examples we have end with 5-1 or 5-7-1. That's a progression that you're going to see a lot of throughout this course. I just wanted to point that out. Let's listen once more to the piece, and then we'll move on to our last example.
Aloha, oi. Aloha, oi. E ke ona no I ka libe. One fond.
And we're going to stick with the key of A-flat major for our last example, which is an art song by Louise Reichard called Die Blume der Blumen, or The Flower of Flowers. 2 things I'd like you to listen for as we hear the excerpt. First thing, how often is there a change of harmony? How do we know how often we should be putting Roman numerals for new harmonies? Secondly, I mentioned in the last example that a chord progression we've heard a bunch today is 5-1 or 5-7-1. So do we hear any instances of 5-1 or 5-7-1 in this example?
Es blüht eine schöne Blume in einem weiten Land, die ist so selig geschaffen, die ist so selig geschaffen und wenigen bekannt.
The instructions here give us a bit of a hint. They say, identify the chords. Each measure contains 2 chords, except for certain measures, 2, 6, and 10, which contain only 1 chord. The lowest note should be regarded as the base of the chord. What we're talking about here is often called harmonic rhythm, the range of chord change. Does each chord last 1 beat, 1 measure, 4 measures, 1 fraction of a beat? One clue, a rule of thumb that often works, is when there is a new bass note, that means it's a new harmony, or a change of chord inversion with the same harmony. So the bass is often a clue, looking at the bass and listening to the bass to help us with the analysis. In every excerpt we've looked at today, the piece has begun with a 1 chord. So the harmony in bar 1, A flat, C, E flat, Roman numeral 1. And the other thing we've noticed today is that Roman numeral 1 is a pretty common Roman numeral to see. That's part of what makes the piece feel like it's in a key, is if the chord, the tonic chord of that key, appears pretty often. So I've labeled all the instances of 1 chords. They're mostly in root position, but on the second system we have a 1-6. Why 1-6? Because it has a C in the bass. And in the second to last bar, I have an A-flat major chord with E-flat in the bass. That's a second inversion chord, or a 6-4 chord. For today we're going to label that 1-6-4, but I put an asterisk next to that because later on in the course we're going to learn a different way to think about that chord. If you're already familiar with the idea of cadential 6-4, we're going to learn later on in the course to analyze that a different way. Okay, how about the other harmonies? Take a look in the second half of measure 1. E-flat, B-flat, D-flat, G. What kind of chord is that? And do you see any other instances of the same harmony? So we've already seen today that dominant 7th chords, 5-7 chords, are quite common. One of the most common chords there is, and especially common at ends of pieces, ends of phrases, ends of excerpts to have 5-7-1. Just a few things to add here. It's really important to distinguish 5-7 versus 5, a 7th chord versus a triad. So for example, when I marked just 5 on the word Land, there we just have 3 notes, E-flat, G, B-flat. If there's no 7th, don't put a 7. You'll see on the second system of this example, we have a few 5-7 chords in inversions. So we have 5-4-2, because there's D-flat in the bass. We have 5-4-3, because there's B-flat in the bass. The only note you need to look at to tell the inversion is the bass. What if you forget 4-2 or 4-3, forget those numbers? Well, you can always double check them or figure them out by measuring the intervals from the bass to the other notes. So in the 5-4-2 chord, D-flat's in the bass. If you go up a 4th, you get a G. If you go up a 2nd, you get an E-flat. That's where those numbers come from. That's how you can check, did you do them correctly? Okay, we're almost done. How about in measure 5, the first half of that bar, I have A-flat, F, A-flat, D-flat. So that's really just 3 different notes, A-flat, F, D-flat. What's the root? What's the quality? What's the Roman numeral? And what's the inversion? Take a moment to think about that. So that's a D-flat major chord, a 4 chord, and it's in second inversion. It's in 6-4 position. Have you noticed today we haven't seen so many 6-4 chords? They're probably the rarest kind of chord, and later on in the term we'll learn why that is. So this bar is a 4 chord, a D-flat major chord. We have just one harmony left to deal with. Bar 8, the second half of the bar. Is that the same chord? We have D-flat, we have F, oh, but we have B. So what kind of chord is that? What inversion? What figured bass? So that's a B-flat minor chord, B-flat, D-flat, F. So that would be 2 in the key of A-flat major, and it's in first inversion because we have a D-flat in the bass, 2-6. And now we've completed our analysis. Let's listen to this excerpt and then we'll wrap up the lesson.
Es blüht eine schöne Blume in einem weiten Land, die ist zu selig geschaffen, die ist zu selig geschaffen und wenigen bekannt.
So today we've studied 4 examples of vocal music, songs, art songs, and chorales spanning from the Baroque period through the late 19th century. I want to review just a couple of tips and takeaways that will help you with your analysis and with this week's assignment. First, reduce or simplify complicated textures so you can focus just on the notes in the chord. You might find it helpful on a separate piece of manuscript paper just to write down the notes in the chord. Second, stack the notes in thirds so you can identify the root and identify the quality of the chord you're dealing with. Third, identify the Roman numeral by thinking in the key. If you know what key you're in, you can always count to figure out, is this a 1 chord, is this a 4 chord, is this a 6 chord, and so on. Remember that the bass note alone determines the inversion. It doesn't matter what order the other notes are above the bass. If the third of the chord is in the bass, it is a first inversion chord. If the root is in the bass, it is a root position chord. And you want to indicate the inversion using figured bass numbers. You have to memorize the figured bass numbers for triads and for seventh chords. You just have to know them. And lastly, once you analyze a chord, look for other instances of the same chord. I cannot emphasize this enough. This will save you lots of time in your music theory career. Once you know D, F sharp A is a 1 chord, look for every D, F sharp A. Every time you see that, that's a 1 chord. That will save you a lot of time in your work and help you to analyze more quickly. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've learned something from it. If you have questions or comments, we have a message board on myCourses, and I look forward to seeing you next week.